Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This video contains my reading of a Substack essay I wrote last year on how to train your dragon. I always planned to do a reading of this essay, but what I did not plan on doing was addressing feedback. A friend wrote a response essay, and, after talking to him privately, I decided it would be fruitful to discuss his essay response and make some of my positions clearer. Therefore, at the end of this reading, there will be a response segment. Before we continue to the reading, I'll just plug quickly. I have published books, and you can access my Amazon author page below and find my books in Amazon stores everywhere. Buy now! And now, on to the reading. Stories, Masculinity and Archetypes. An important observation from How to Train Your Dragon. On my YouTube channel, I went through a phase of making videos on matters related to masculinity in fiction. These videos are as follows. April 2019, a presentation on the appeal of 300, open brackets, and discussing how it contrasts with current Western culture. June 2019, concerning damsels in distress, open brackets, an explanation of the convention. July 2019, a look at anime male protagonists, open brackets, or why are anime male characters so weak? May 2020, an explanation for 2D women and anime waifus, or its full title, On the Waifu Phenomenon and the Massive Popularity of 2D Anime Women on the Internet, an explanation for 2D women and anime waifus. July 2020, the core reasons for SAO's success. May 2023, explaining the appeal of action heroines, open brackets, and tomboys. This spans a period of 5 years. That is, these videos span a period of 5 years. During the earliest part of this period, and until just recently, I thought about making a video on the DreamWorks film How to Train Your Dragon. My analysis would have concerned the character of Hiccup, and the central thesis would be how he is a subversion of masculinity in the story. To help understand what my essay would have touched upon, we need to briefly run through the film's plot. The plot of How to Train Your Dragon. The film's plot follows Hiccup, who is the son of a fearsome Viking chieftain, Stoic the Vast, who rules Berk Village. The village is raided by dragons on a regular basis, and all the men, and even the women, are strong and tough warriors. Hiccup is nothing like his father. He is weak, scrawny, and not skilled at arms, but he is talented at invention and engineering. Hiccup is intelligent, yet he is terrible at fighting, and inspires no confidence in either his father or anyone else in the village, and he's a loner loser. One night, he uses one of his inventions to shoot down a Night Fury, the fastest and most dangerous species of dragon. His idea is to prove himself to his father by shooting one down with his contraption, killing it and cutting its heart out. But when Hiccup arrives where the dragon has crash-landed, he cannot bring himself to kill the reptile. He instead frees the dragon, and it tries to fly away, but, since it has lost part of its tail in the crash, it cannot physically fly. Hiccup eventually befriends the dragon, and creates a prosthetic tail so it can fly again. But, because it is a mechanical device and not a cybernetic limb, Hiccup has to help operate it, and so he becomes the first dragon rider. While he is doing this, Hiccup is sent to dragon training with all the other kids in the village, including a girl called Astrid, whom he has a crush on. Astrid is a tomboy, and is better at fighting than he is. She disrespects and disregards him like everyone else, of course. Hiccup triumphs in dragon training, but not through fighting. Instead, he learns about dragons from spending time with the downed dragon, whom he names Toothless, and uses this knowledge to subdue other dragons without hurting them. To keep this section brief, Hiccup saves the day by learning how to ride a dragon. He teaches others how to ride dragons as well, wins Astrid's affections, and saves the day by dragon riding. He finally gets the approval and respect of his father, and the film ends on a happy and triumphant note. My analysis from a time past. My analysis of the above plot would hone in on the fact that Hiccup doesn't grow or develop any masculine or martial virtues. He doesn't grow stronger, and he doesn't become more skilled at arms. In fact, he shirks the whole process of becoming more masculine and manly via the use of dragons and technology. By the end of the film, he is still the same limp noodle and weed that he was at the start. The unintentional/intentional message of the film is thus: you don't need to acquire the masculine skills or develop the manly warrior virtues of your fathers. This is the message, not because Hiccup is a skilled machinist, or because he saves the day by dragon riding, but because of the context. If Hiccup wasn't a weed, if he had grit and a respectable affinity for fighting, like Astrid, on top of his machinist talents, then How to Train Your Dragon would not be the story of how a loser became a winner by shirking the masculine virtues of his father, but instead a tale of how an up-and-coming warrior learnt to train dragons. These might sound like superficial alterations to the character, since the actual plot of the story wouldn't change, but it would transform the film's message to this: the masculine warrior virtues of your fathers are good, but your mind should be open to new possibilities. I would argue the actual film does not affirm masculine virtues, but my suggested and improved version does. I'd then either explicitly argue or else impress the implication upon viewers that media, such as How to Train Your Dragon, are part of a larger phenomenon wherein mainstream creators try to influence men and women into believing that old notions of masculinity and manliness are outdated. The present day. This is the critique I would have made of How to Train Your Dragon as little as maybe 1 year ago, but this is not the opinion I hold today. It's not that I believe my argument above is wholly wrong per se, rather that it doesn't account for the whole picture. Back in 2018, I was younger and had just started martial arts. I became enthusiastic about kickboxing and Muay Thai. As a consequence, I also became interested in health and fitness. Preceding my foray into the world of martial arts and fitness, I had read a lot of Manosphere web articles from all the major blogs, including Return of Kings, as it was still live during this period. In fact, it was because I read these Manospherian bloggers that I decided to take up martial arts. I was persuaded by the arguments that it wasn't good for a man to be incapable of defending himself. I now give this strange and unusual disclaimer. I still do martial arts to this day, and I believe every man should train. Why am I giving this disclaimer? Because what I'm going to argue next, using How to Train Your Dragon as my springboard, is going to sound like an argument against combat training. Here's what How to Train Your Dragon gets right about boys, men, and masculinity. Not all men can be warriors. Masculine archetypes. The most recognizable masculine archetype in stories and media, both in the past and the present, has to be the warrior. When we encounter warriors in real life, we recognize them as men among men. But what makes a warrior? Contrary to popular belief, it's not simply a matter of employment in a particular profession and the possession of specific tools, or the development of specialized skills. Anyone can be trained to shoot a gun, but that doesn't make him a soldier. In the same way, anyone can be taught how to draw, but that doesn't make him an artist. It is true that you are what you do, and especially what you consistently do as a habit. Aristotle is not wrong when he makes this observation. However, there is a limit to this rule. Someone could train me to act like an American. I could move to the USA, adopt the accent, the customs and politics, get citizenship, and eat the right foods, but I'd never become an authentic American. It is not just about how one acts. It's also about who he is. It is a question of being as much as doing. The warrior does not fight to become a warrior, he fights because he is a warrior. The warrior was born to fight. His instincts lead him to master combat and to develop his strength. It is where he is in his element. This is what it means to be a man who embodies the warrior/fighter archetype. After much self-reflection, I can say with confidence that I am not a warrior. It is not for lack of trying or wanting. At one time I believed every man could be a warrior/fighter with enough training and dedication. But even after 7 years of training in martial arts, really only 5, because lockdowns took away 2 years of my life, I haven't become a warrior or a fighter. I have simply learned how to fight. While my current level of skill is and was a factor in reaching this conclusion, none of this is to say that I believe people who have an aptitude for violence are automatically warriors/fighters. I have met all kinds of people who are more skilled and dangerous than myself, but I have only met one or two whom I'd describe as warriors/fighters. In the past, I believed the archetypical warrior potential was inside every man, and I thought I could unlock it within myself. In truth, I longed to realize this potential, which I believed to be real. But it is impossible to unlock a treasure chest, which doesn't exist, even if you have the key. The truth is, I do not embody the warrior archetype. Instead, I embody another archetype. In fact, I have a foot in two different archetypes, the creator and the thinker. It's more than the fact that I write novels and video essays which makes me a creator and a thinker. It's that these are the means by which I express myself fully. I do these things because I am a creator and thinker, not because I want to be a creator and thinker. For as long as I can remember, I have been drawn to creativity, philosophy, logic, and argumentation. When I was a child, I wrote, read, debated, and sought out information pertaining to these interests. The instinct and drive were natural. I did and continue to do these things because this is where I'm in my element and where I feel called. I grew my joint creator and thinker potential via mental and creative endeavors many years ago, and I did so without being consciously aware of it. In my adult years, my efforts to further grow and strengthen these skills and nature have been conscious and deliberate. If I had a foot or both in the warrior archetype's camp, I would have started martial arts much earlier, because I would have been drawn to fighting. But that potential was not within me, so I felt no call or drive to it. I was on an altogether different journey. The realization that I am not a warrior and cannot become one has caused me no small amount of pain and depression, because warriorhood is something I have always admired and, until recently, believed I could achieve in myself. The reason I have always admired the warrior is because he is the most potent personification of masculinity, and the most masculine men in both history and legend have always been warriors. My goal and desire was to become a warrior poet, but, although warrior poets are real, Ernest Junger springs to mind, I only have the spirit of a poet, and not the dual spirit of a warrior poet. Only now have I started to make peace with this revelation. How to Train Your Dragon and Fatherhood. Hiccup's father, Stoic the Vast, is obviously a warrior. He is a purebred specimen of the warrior archetype. Hiccup, despite wanting and trying to be one, isn't a warrior. While this is not Stoic's fault, he has failed as a father in the film. He is dismissive. He doesn't appreciate Hiccup's innate talents for invention and engineering, and doesn't encourage him in developing these strengths. He also frequently ignores him and doesn't listen to him in conversations. As a consequence, Hiccup has little self-confidence, and he is whiny and doesn't have a lot of self-respect either. In an ideal world, Stoic would encourage and show interest in Hiccup's talents, and Hiccup would be more self-assured and not whiny. As it stands in the beginning of the film, both have chosen the worst possible responses to the fact that Hiccup simply isn't a warrior like Stoic. Of course, most of the blame falls on Stoic's shoulders. As a father, he should have taken the time to understand and encourage Hiccup in his natural talents, and patiently taught him in the ways of fighting, while bearing in mind that his son would not take to it like a fish to water. He should have loved his son. Instead, Stoic actively disapproves of his son's temperament and abilities, and is clearly disappointed with him. For his part, Hiccup reacts how any young boy/man would in this situation. He becomes immensely discouraged, while still trying to gain his father's approval. I would almost maintain today that the film does a disservice to Stoic and masculine warrior virtues by letting Hiccup basically get away with saving the day without acquiring proficiency in any of them. The film affirms the value of Hiccup's skills without doing the same for Stoics, and so dismisses one masculine archetype in favour of another. Again, I would almost maintain this, because After re-watching the film, I noticed that the warrior archetype is affirmed throughout. Multiple times, Hiccup is saved from dragons by Stoic, Gobber, and Astrid, who use violence and strength of arms, sometimes literally. Stoic is brave and heroic. When he leads his army to certain doom on the Dragon Island, he tells his men to retreat, and goes to distract the Queen Dragon to buy them time. It is too simplistic to say that the film dismisses what warriors bring to the table, because it portrays them as heroic, useful, and necessary. But coming back around to our topic, the film speaks truth. Not all men and boys can become warriors. It's one thing to expect men and boys like Hiccup to learn how to fight. It is another thing to expect them to be fighters. Many masculine archetypes. The warrior isn't the only realization or archetype of masculinity in the world. It may be the most obvious and easily recognizable, but it is not the be-all and end-all, and we shouldn't want it to be either. A few years ago, when he still posted essays on his website, Jack Donovan wrote a blog post arguing that our ideas about masculinity have become cartoonish. Jack Donovan eviscerated the idea that we should all be trying to achieve a lumberjack aesthetic, temperament, and spirit. He dismissed the suggestion that this is the benchmark, the ideal standard of masculinity, which all men should strive to emulate. He pointed out that men had all kinds of interests in the past, from engineering to botany to fashion, and they were allowed to have these interests and passions without having their manliness questioned. He argued that the fascination guys have with being manly, growing beards, and only engaging in stereotypically masculine hobbies and professions is a modern phenomenon. I agree with his commentary and its sentiment. Expecting every guy to shoehorn himself into a single masculine archetype is like expecting every gym-going man to achieve the shredded and bulked physique of Jared Butler in 300, which, as honest fitness trainers, models, and bodybuilders point out, is physically impossible for the vast majority of men, even with the aid of steroids. Manifestations of masculinity are far more varied, and we should learn not only to explore different varieties, but also to embrace them, both in art and in real life. We do everyone a disservice when, for instance, we bully and shame a boy for possessing deep emotions and feelings. Contrary to popular belief, trying to shame said boy into manning up and growing thicker skin only works on a superficial level. He will act more stoic, but he won't get tougher in a real sense, because he'll just conceal his pains and emotions behind a dead and lifeless face. He will have thick skin, but at the cost of authentic expression and colour in his life. What you will have at the end of this process is a man, hurting inside, who lives a bland and colourless existence, which manifests in the form of a low-key, lifeless energy and depression. What's worse is the diminishing of his emotional depth and experience will result in the weakening of his key character strengths. Being sensitive is not always a weakness. It can be a tremendous strength in the right fields. Most of the great male artists throughout history would be considered sensitive, but their sensitivity helped them to create the work everyone enjoys today. A man who has an emotional or creative sensitivity will never fully realize his potential and know happiness until he accepts his sensitivities as good and integrates them into his character. Attempting to be a stoic, tough, and unfeeling man, when he isn't one, will cause inner emptiness and a reduction in outward vitality as he straitjackets himself according to social expectations. To prevent any misunderstanding, this is not an argument in defense of weakness. This is not an appeal to let certain boys and men be vulnerable and unable to stand on their own 2 feet, or to be soft. This is an appeal not to shame them for what and who they are, and not to try shoving a square peg into a round hole. In a similar vein, if we tried shaming a tough and adventurous boy with no real sensitivities into being open with his emotions, or attempted to bully him into being artistically sensitive, etc., we'd be doing a crime just as heinous. Square peg, round hole. The goal of parenting for boys should be to help them develop the skills, virtues, and fortitude to take on the dangers that life will throw at them, and help them achieve their full potential and become fully realized men. The aim should not be to straitjacket them into a hypermasculine caricature, or to rid them of their toxic masculinity, quote unquote. There are no constructive outcomes for trying to impose a one-size-fits-all standard of masculinity on all men. Not all men can be warriors, and it takes all sorts to make a world. A man's telos. I am sure there are some men who will take issue with what I have written because they will misconstrue it as a kind of defeatism. They might respond that it is possible for all men to become fighters. For instance, if they triple their efforts, time, and energy to the transformation, they might argue, a man may not be a natural fighter, but if he spends enough time and effort, he could acquire the skills and character of a natural fighter. To this potential response, I must confess that I think it is probably correct. It is probably possible for a guy who is not a fighter to forcefully pull himself into the warrior archetype. Hypothetically, if we had a man with all the time and money in the world, an extreme passionate dedication to fighting, and access to the greatest trainers, he could forge himself into a fighter if he started young enough and spent enough time at it. If we take the above premise as true, the question is less if a man should do this, and more why. If a man isn't a fighter, why should he try becoming one? Wouldn't his time, money, and effort be better spent realizing who he truly is? Wouldn't it be better for himself, the world, his friends, and family if he developed his own potential and embraced the archetype to which he belongs? Wouldn't it be better if he found his true telos, purpose, rather than attempting to answer a calling which is not his? Again, it is one thing to ask that every man trains and learns to defend himself. It is another to expect every man to become a warrior or act like one. Similarly, it is one thing to ask every man to learn how to drive. It is another to expect every man to become a race driver. One man might be a natural businessman, another an artist, and yet another an engineer or builder. For all these men, it would be better if they spent their time and effort developing their natural potential, embracing their archetype, and realizing their unique telos, rather than trying to become something they are not. We should encourage men to manifest their masculine archetypes and give them due respect for doing so. We shouldn't put the warrior archetype on a pedestal in both our art and conversations, and we should cease using it as the yardstick for measuring manhood and masculinity. Instead, we should be encouraging every man to discover his telos. Final thoughts on How to Train Your Dragon. The previous critique of How to Train Your Dragon, which an earlier version of myself would have made, goes wide of the mark because it assumes the only acceptable masculine archetype is the warrior. By ignoring the many other existing masculine archetypes, the critique does not only a disservice to Hiccup, but also the vast majority of men, both past and present. In closing, I think we should look at the film's actual and intended message. The film is clear and upfront about what it wants to say. In the beginning, Gobber tells Hiccup that he should stop trying to be something he's not. In the middle of the story, Stoic tells Hiccup he needs to be less of this, and gestures to all of his son. But at the end of the film, he tells Hiccup that it turned out we needed more of this, and gestures to all of him. The message is that we should accept and love people for who they are, and not disregard or shame them for not fitting into our preferred social and societal niches. As far as messages in stories go, this one has become a little cliché, and has been abused by some people, yet How to Train Your Dragon delivers its message deftly, and it is still relevant in our modern age. So that was the Substack essay. It has been some time since it was published, so I have a few things to add here. The first is that I have recently quit martial arts after 7, really only 5, years of practice. I imagine that I will return to martial arts in the future, but at the moment it doesn't seem to be the most optimal investment of my time. I have taken up the gym in earnest so that I do not turn into a couch potato. Nevertheless, my advice to take up martial arts still stands for any man who has done no training and does not know how to defend himself. I do not regret spending those 7 years training in martial arts, and it is one of the best decisions I have ever made. Finally, I want to talk about some responses I received to this essay. One was from a mutual on Twitter, or X as it is now known. The writer J.D. Soavage posted this image in response to the essay. It is remarkable when you find an ancient quote that concisely summarizes one of the ideas in an essay you have just written. Brevity is the soul of wit, and succinctness is the soul of sagacity. Lastly, the author John Wander wrote a wonderful response essay, which I recommend reading personally. It will be in the description box below. Wander agreed with the general thrust of my essay, but disagreed on some particulars. We agreed to disagree, and left the conversation on good terms. As an aside, if you are watching this, Wander, please do start a blog or substack if you find the time. For the purposes of this video, I believe it is only fair to review these points of contention. Now, in case it needs stating directly, I have nothing but the utmost respect for Wander's arguments and essay, which are the fruit of thoughtful contemplation and a powerful focus of the mind. John Wander offers a different perspective on the nature of true warriors, and has a more critical view of the film How to Train Your Dragon. In my essay, I declare that men with warrior spirits are naturally drawn to fighting and combat. However, Wander argues that there have been a number of men throughout history who had no particular inclinations for fighting or war, but who are nevertheless famous for being warriors. He cites as examples Alvin York and Samuel Whitmore, who had no natural inclination for conflict beyond some scuffles and brawls in their youth. He provides a counterexample in the famous Ronin samurai, Musashi, writer of the Book of Five Rings, who was very much inclined to violence, and who engaged in 60 duels to the death, and triumphed in every last one. Wander's point with all these examples is that it is more difficult to pin down what makes a true warrior, and my proposition that warriors are drawn to battle is too simplistic. Since, as he demonstrates, there are accomplished warriors in the history books who weren't keen on violence, and didn't see it as their telos, or vocation. The obvious open question is thus: are men like York and Whitmore true warriors? Did they have warrior spirits? Or were they simply men of another sort, who were good, excellent even, at fighting? This is where the contention lies. I am inclined to answer no, and Wander is inclined to answer yes. I don't think the true answer will ever be divined. Another, smaller contention related to the subject of true warriorhood is the matter of natural talent, as Wander quotes Musashi, who argues even someone with no natural talent can become a warrior with training. Here I must confess that I may have overemphasized the importance of natural talents and affinities for one's archetype/telos in my original essay. This was not my intention. I will say here that a man may be called for a particular purpose, and he may have strong inclinations and dedicated passion, and yet still not have any discernible natural talent. In short, a man may be a warrior, but he might have to work hard to realize his true potential. Conversely, someone can have natural talent in one field or another, but feel no purpose in that arena, and instead feel the call to some other mission. What I am trying to say is that the matter of archetype and telos is a soul matter, rather than a mental or physiological one. Towards the end of my essay, I talk about how it might be possible for someone to pull himself into the warrior archetype, and I realise it wasn't clear that I was talking about changing one's spirit, rather than their physical prowess and mental skills. Because of course it is possible for someone like the man described to learn how to fight and become extremely good at fighting under the hypothetical conditions. That cannot be reasonably questioned. What I think is questionable is whether he can attain a warrior's spirit, purpose and telos, and that is what I mean when I say it might be possible for a non-warrior to pull himself into the warrior archetype. I mean it might be possible to undergo a spiritual transformation, although I am unconvinced. While we are on this subject, I would like to clarify that when I talk about the warrior archetype and others in my Substack article, I'm examining said archetypes from an amoral position. There are warriors who fight for evil, and there are warriors who fight for good, but warriors they still are. The same is true for thinkers, creators, etc. Before we move on to the next contention, I need to say a couple of things about some matters which Wanda raised in his response essay. As already mentioned, Wanda talks about the Book of Five Rings. I actually acquired a paperback copy and read it, and I wish I had read it before I started my own foray into martial arts. I can highly recommend it if you are involved in martial arts or thinking about becoming so. Wanda also shares a video of a Sifu of a karate dojo who talks about brain damage from heavy contact sparring. I am glad Wanda included this video, and since I have extolled the goodness of martial arts in my essay, I feel I have a responsibility to say something here. Brain damage from sparring is real. If you take any forceful blows to the head, the brain is impacted. And by forceful blows, I mean any strike which hurts your head or moves your neck. To stop and/or drastically reduce the chances of brain damage while training, full contact sparring should be controlled, and the focus should be on skill and technique rather than force. Force should be saved for the pads and the punching bag. Developing mastery in martial arts is not worth it if your brain ends up resembling Swiss cheese. If you are a practitioner of martial arts, you would do well to practice caution and ensure that everyone respects the brain in sparring. Some martial arts dojos, schools, and clubs do not practice caution and look down on people who want to be careful with their brain. If you are in such a club and they belittle you for wanting to protect your brain and do not respect any concerns about possible life-altering injuries, you should consider joining another dojo, school, or club. I will admit freely that concerns about my brain were a factor in my own recent decision to turn away from martial arts. Alright, on to the final contention. Wanda does not like How to Train Your Dragon. He agrees with the points about masculinity, which I make using How to Train Your Dragon, but he doesn't believe the film serves as a good morality tale or example. I would recommend reading Wanda's passionate yet clear-headed criticisms of How to Train Your Dragon yourself. For the sake of brevity, I will summarize his take on How to Train Your Dragon, mention some of his specific criticisms, and share my thoughts. He begins by saying that he doesn't like, quote, the monsters aren't really bad guys, plot lines. He concedes that such plot lines can be done well, but thinks that it is done badly in How to Train Your Dragon, and compares it to, quote, Boomer Kumbaya. The heart of Wanda's critique is in these paragraphs. Quote, Hiccup's courage, his warrior virtues, is shown by rejecting his society publicly. His greatest moment of testing has him throw away his weapons and say, I am not one of them. Stoic may do some cool things, but this right here is the real message of the film. Rejection of the in-group and tradition, and its virtues, for lizards. Like it would be so hard to convince a bunch of Vikings it'd be cool to ride dragons. In fact, I've been told in a spin-off series, the villainous Vikings conclude exactly that at first sight of someone riding a dragon. These guys aren't Vikings. That's just the costume. Real Vikings might not have held Hiccup as a great man, but they'd be all over the idea of riding dragons. Seriously, has Stoic raided anybody at all? This is an American story in costume, with unfortunately a current year American ethos. The setup is very artificial, but needed so that the society as a whole, and Hiccup's dad in particular, can man up and do what his son tells him to do. This isn't just Hiccup rejecting the role of a warrior in the most literal sense. It's him rejecting his people and their ways. His victory isn't in him coming of age, but of society doing so for him. He's not rejecting anything truly wrong. He's not walking away from Umlias or refusing to take part in human sacrifice. He's rejecting his people and all that means. Why? Because he thinks they're mean to the lizard monsters who've been attacking them for Odin only knows how long, when they have zero reason to believe otherwise. The rest is just characters being stupid for the sake of the plot playing out just so. It practically dances with Wolves' level of propaganda and the same spirit. Ironic that, in a Viking setting, He'd have had the perfect opportunity to be the good guy in rejecting these traditions if the Vikings ever, went a Viking. Replace the dragon he was to kill with a European villager or monk trying to survive Stoics' raids, and the story changes drastically. Yes, in the story, this was a good change he was insisting on, but in some stories, Lancelot's affair with Guinevere is depicted as a beautiful thing that's not even a little bit wrong. Adulteresses love that idea for the same reason Californian liberal arts types love the idea of their father being humbled and finally seeing they were right. Both have had a strong and negative effect on society. This is how propaganda works. End quote. He then says this at the end of his response. I will say unambiguously that King Emperor Penguin's bigger point about needing a more holistic view of masculinity and even culture as a whole is true, timely, and of the utmost importance, not only for various non-warrior characters, but even for warrior ones. For too long have the virtues been cut off from one another, and so are going mad. But I don't believe How to Train Your Dragon is what we need. End quote. These are strong words, and it is perhaps obvious what the nature of our contention is. I'll share my perspective on these arguments before concluding this video. Out of the gate, I disagree entirely with the sentiment that the monsters aren't the real bad guys' plotline is done poorly in the film, because the dragons are not monsters as such. Some of them are frightful looking, but so are lions and tigers when they snarl at you. And just because big cats kill human beings doesn't mean that they are bad guys or monsters. The dragons in How to Train Your Dragon are closer to big, intelligent cats, which can be tamed, rather than monsters, and I think they are best understood as intelligent pack animals. The dragons aren't representations of sin or of the demonic, like in medieval tales, and they are not aberrations or spawns of chaos as depicted in more traditional fantasy stories. The dragons appear to be a natural part of the world, and are neither fey nor magical. Of course, all I've said here doesn't apply to the queen dragon, who is a monstrous tyrant who has enslaved all the other dragons somehow. She seems unnatural, like an abomination, and she is not portrayed as a good or ordinary creature. Alright, but what about the main thrust of Wanda's critique? His first point is really a subsidiary issue, and not all important, but the paragraphs quoted in full are central to all his other criticisms. I will say that I agree with his points about how propaganda works, but I would not say that How to Train Your Dragon is propaganda made by, quote, Californian liberal arts types who love the idea of their father being humbled and finally seeing they were right. I also think it is unfair to compare Californians to adulteresses. I mean, Californians are bad, but they're not that bad. I do not think that How to Train Your Dragon is propaganda, either structurally or spiritually, as Wanda contends. But, and there is a but here, Wanda is right about the story's Viking society being an all-American society, just with Scottish accents, and that the film is engaged in cultural critique. Following Wanda's line of thought, I can see how the film is a product of Blue America, which is critical of Red America. For those who aren't familiar with these terms, what I mean is this. The film is made by American leftists and is critical of traditional American culture. There is a strong undercurrent of socio-political cultural critique here. Hiccup breaks with the traditions of his folk, denounces them publicly, rather than privately speaking with the village leaders to try and persuade them to take a different path. This would obviously have been far wiser than what he actually does. He takes the side of the foreign other, aka the dragons, rather than his own people, a recurring theme in nearly all contemporary media, especially of the woke variety. Basically, the film is anti-conservative in the broadest sense. And when I say anti-conservative, I mean anti-tradition, oikophobic, and xenophilic. And of course, it is certainly possible that the creative team had some daddy issues which influenced the plot beats concerning Hiccup and his father. The film may not be woke or progressive per se, but it is not neutral. However, I would contend here that a story is not a work of propaganda by virtue of having political and/or cultural stances, even if it has some of the effects of a propaganda piece. A man may drink either wine or water to hydrate his parched throat, but while both drinks will reach this end, that doesn't mean they are the same liquid. I am unconvinced the spirit of How to Train Your Dragon or the setup of its story is artificial, and I don't see the obvious hallmarks of propaganda in the film. One of these days, I'll write a Substack article discussing what I think makes a story propaganda. I would make a YouTube video, but I'd probably get in hot water for displaying and analysing posters from the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. But, for the record, I don't agree with George Orwell's famous quip on propaganda and art, which is now visible on the screen. That is the sum of the friendly contentions Wanda and I have on this topic. Before ending this video, I'd like to explore an agreement I have with Wanda. Wanda says this to conclude his essay. I will say unambiguously that King Emperor Penguin's bigger point about needing a more holistic view of masculinity and even culture as a whole is true, timely, and of the utmost importance. Not only for various non-warrior characters, but even for warrior ones. For too long have the virtues been cut off from one another, and so are going mad. But I don't believe How to Train Your Dragon is what we need. I agree with the entirety of his final statement, including his last sentence. This may sound strange considering my essay, and everything I have just said, but I don't agree with Wanda for the same reasons. I will maintain that How to Train Your Dragon does well in presenting a more holistic view of masculinity. However, it could have been done so much better, especially in the other two films. The cornerstone of this problem is Hiccup just isn't aspirational or inspirational. I have watched all 3 films of How to Train Your Dragon. Only the first one is worth watching. And Hiccup just isn't aspirational in spite of his existent virtues. Even Stoic at his worst in How to Train Your Dragon is awesome, cool, aspirational, and inspirational. This is why Stoic is my favourite character. Now, Hiccup is more relatable than Stoic, which isn't a bad thing, but he never comes into his own or becomes a man. Even as Hiccup grows older in the trilogy, he doesn't become more masculine, more accomplished, or grow at all. He remains weedy, unimpressive, unassertive, and uninspiring. Now, in the first film, this is understandable, because Hiccup is still just a boy, and he is on the way to becoming a man. For this reason, we shouldn't expect him to be far on the journey of self-actualization. But as the trilogy progresses, and he becomes the chieftain of the village, his still existent weaknesses become unforgivable, and his lack of growth becomes disconcerting and distressing. Sadly, Hiccup is an early example of a trend which was only picking up speed in the early 2000s, and now has become a staple of modern fiction made by the mainstream media industry. It is anathema nowadays for modern mainstream writers to depict male characters who are competent, strong, and confident, unless they are the villains in the story. Mainstream writers are only comfortable writing heroes who are goofy, dorky, and soft, and who lack any gravitas. Often, these male characters are used as the butt of numerous jokes. Particularly egregious examples can be found in The Dragon Prince, for which I am writing a Substack essay. And of course, whenever mainstream writers do have a hero who is competent, strong, and confident, they feel obliged to have him humbled by, or subjugated to, one of the heroines, or just simply outshone by the heroines. It is easy to see how Hiccup fits into the trend of the adorable, unthreatening, and weak male who has become ever present in modern media today. Wanda is right. We do need something better. That is all for today. You are cordially invited to like, share, and subscribe, both on YouTube and on Substack. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day.